Here we go. 3 years later. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Contra Costa County Regional Alternative Compliance System Workshop. It's just 9 a.m. right now. Looks like people are still joining the meeting. We're gonna give a couple more minutes for everyone to join. Welcome to the Contra Costa County Regional Alternative Compliance System Workshop. We'll be starting in just one more minute. Thank you for waiting. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the Contra Costa County Regional Alternative Compliance System Workshop. We are going to be getting started right now. So to start with introductions, we'll just go over the web meeting instructions and the rules for question and answer today. We'll give you these same instructions again when we get to the question and answer period, so you don't have to write them all down right now. But essentially throughout the meeting as we're presenting, all attendees will be on mute until we open up the line for comments and questions. When you want to speak during the Q&A section, you can raise your hand using the raise hand feature. And then me as the facilitator, I will open up your microphone. If you're on the phone, you can raise your hand with *9 and then mute and unmute using *6. To type a question or comment into the chat, you can put that into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you open up that Q&A bar, you can type questions in there, and we'll be answering the written questions first and then opening it up for oral questions after. We'll first address questions and comments, as I mentioned, that are written. And then after the meeting, if you have any email comments or questions, you can send those to Kelly Havens at Geosyntec or Amanda Booth at the City of San Pablo. Their email addresses are here. The meeting is also being recorded and will be available at the link shown here after the meeting. So to start, I'll turn it over to Amanda to introduce herself. Amanda, it looks like you are on mute.
Is that working now? So weird, it was working earlier. Hi, my name is Amanda Booth. I'm the Senior Environmental Program Analyst for the City of San Pablo. I currently run their Environmental Services Division, and I've been the project lead for this Regional Alternative Compliance Project.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelly Havens. I'm the Senior Engineer with Geosyntec Consultants and served as a consultant team project manager for the Regional Alternative Compliance Program.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tony Hale. I'm Program Director for Environmental Informatics at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and I've been part of the team as the lead for the software development portion of the project.
All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. Before we get started, I just wanted to thank all of you, or to thank the people that were involved in developing this project. So that includes EPA. They helped to fund this project, as well as the cities of Walnut Creek, Contra Costa County, the City of Richmond, and the Contra Costa Clean Water Program. They were all essential in making this project happen. So with the formalities done, let's go ahead and get started. So next slide. All right. On the screen is the agenda. This presentation is really broken up into two sections. One section is, or the first section will be about how
Amanda, we lost your sound again.
Is that working?
Now it's working.
Man, I don't know why that's automatically coming on. All right, so on the screen is the agenda. This presentation is broken up into two sections. One section, the first section will give an overview of the RAC system, how and why it was developed, and the roles of participants. And after that section, there'll be a question and answer session for anybody that may not be able to stay for the full presentation. The second section is going to get into specifics about the compliance units, costs. We'll give an example. We'll look at the tracking tool, and we'll talk about next steps in the project. Then at the end, there's going to be a second question and answer session for anybody that was able to stay for the full time. All right, go ahead for the next slide. First, we're going to discuss the alternative compliance system and what it is and why it was developed. Go ahead, next slide. So there's a lot of different forms of alternative compliance for stormwater across the country. In the most simple terms, alternative compliance is a system that provides additional flexibility for a regulated discharger to meet their compliance requirements. The overall goal of any alternative compliance system is to provide flexibility in compliance while also achieving the same or better environmental benefit at a reduced cost. So go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, in the Bay Area, our stormwater permit, which is referred to as the MRP, requires development and redevelopment projects over a specific size threshold to treat the stormwater on site. And they do this through low impact development or GSI, so green stormwater infrastructure. In addition, the permit also requires all permittees to treat a specific number of impervious acres, and this is based on their population. This is commonly called the C3J requirement. And so our permit basically requires us to treat a lot of stormwater for various different reasons. Go ahead, next slide. The challenge is, in some instances, meeting this requirement can be incredibly costly or difficult. So to give a couple examples, some areas might have really steep slopes. And so it makes it really difficult to have the stormwater flow to the GSI facilities. Or, for example, in San Pablo, we have an area of the city where we actually don't want to encourage infiltration. And that's because there's some steep slopes in San Pablo that are already prone to slides. And so green infrastructure is not something that makes a lot of sense from a safety perspective in that particular area of the city. Another example where GSI might not be as useful is in maybe a really space constrained downtown area where a project site is really limited for space. They might not have any parking on site just because of its location. And so they want to build lot line to lot line because that land is really valued. So they might not want to use that area for GSI and use it for something else like housing instead. So in addition to that, distributed GSI, so small GSI projects all over the county, they're really costly to maintain, especially when we're talking about road projects and roadside projects. And then in addition to another challenge is that in Contra Costa County, many of our legacy pollutants that are our big water quality concern pollutants are concentrated to just a few areas. So in the map on the right, you'll see a map of Contra Costa County, and the majority of the map is green. And so that means low legacy pollutants for the water quality ones that we're really concerned about, so our TMDLs. But those red areas that you can see, they're concentrated in just a few areas of the city. And those are the areas that we want to treat most because they have the highest concentration of those pollutants. And those are mainly in our old industrial areas, which don't have a whole lot of development going on. So go ahead to the next slide. To solve these problems, a few permittees got together and we developed the Contra Costa County Regional Alternative Compliance System, also called the RAC. This system provides an offsite option to help projects flexibly comply with their stormwater requirements. It's really important to stress that this is an option. No project is required to use this system. It just gives you another option of an additional way to comply with your permit requirements. This system can be used for both development and redevelopment projects for MRP permittees, but it's also been designed so that other permit holders, such as Caltrans or Phase 2 permittees, can use the system as well. The RAC system allows for the investment in regional GSI projects that are cheaper to implement and maintain, and this is largely due to economies of scale. It allows for the strategic placement of GSI facilities in those areas that we can target for legacy pollutants, and it allows for the potential development of additional benefits. An example of this might be an underground treatment system or infiltration system with a regional park on top, and that park might be in a disadvantaged area that's in desperate need of park acres. So we can start to really look at a strategic way to treat stormwater and provide really great benefits to our communities. And then lastly, an important aspect of the system is that it's designed to collect ongoing O&M funding to ensure that these facilities are properly maintained into the future. And as most cities know, O&M funding is incredibly difficult to get, so that's a really important aspect of this project. Go and go to the next slide. So that's kind of the overall what and why. We're briefly going to go over how the system itself was developed in that process. So go to the next slide. In general, alternative compliance systems are allowed through existing rules and guidance provided by both EPA and our regional water boards. This specific system was developed over 3 years and in very close consultation with the Contra Costa County permittees. An advisory committee that was made up of all 9 San Francisco Bay Area counties, Caltrans, and the Port of Oakland. In addition, regulators like EPA and the Water Board were involved. And we had a lot of legal review from both internal and external legal reviewers to make sure the system was following all the legal compliance that it needed to. So it took 3 years. And what we have is the system we're going to present today. Go next slide. So, as far as our specific water board, currently the system has been submitted to the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board for official approval under provision C3E, also known as the Alternative Compliance Provision. We expect to see formal acceptance of the system late this summer or early fall. And once the system is approved, as with all NPDES aspects, the system will be subject to annual reporting to the Water Board through our Contra Costa County annual reports. Next slide. All right, so that's the, let's get into the nuts and bolts now. We're going to give a quick overview of the system, talk about how it works and the various roles of the different entities that may want to be involved. Next slide. All right, this is a graphic of the system overview. There are 4 main aspects or roles in the RAC system, and they each have a different color on the screen. In the orange, we have the sellers, and these are the entities that will design, build, and maintain GSI projects. In the blue at the bottom, we have buyers, and these are the entities that might want to purchase compliance units so they don't have to build GSI on site or can minimize the amount of GSI they build on site. In the green, we have the system administrators, which will be both jurisdictions in Contra Costa County and the Contra Costa Clean Water Program. And then in the gray is the ongoing O&M component of the system. I'm going to go over each of these roles in details, and then we'll come back to this full graphic so you can see it all together. Next slide. So first, we have the sellers. In the RAC system, sellers are entities that design, construct, and maintain offsite GSI projects. First thing to note is that these projects must be non-regulated projects. So they can't be treating water that is already being required to be treated to the permit. So they have to be non-regulated. The role of a seller is to build a project, which is done through the typical development and approval process. They must request certification of this treatment system during and after construction, and we'll go over what certification means. Then after certification, the compliance units will be listed on the tracking tool and they're eligible for sale through the RAC system. Once sold, the seller will receive payments for these units. In addition, the seller will perform annual maintenance, and after the maintenance is verified, they will receive payment for the maintenance that was performed. Sellers will likely include MRP permittees, potentially some contractors or developers, and then even P3s or public-private partnerships or community-based public-private partnerships. In other areas of the country where they have done alternative compliance system, P3s can be an important partner in this. And so we'll discuss that a little bit later. Go ahead, next slide. All right, buyers. The buyer's role in the system is actually quite simple. They pay money. They'll need to work with the jurisdictions in which they want to build the project to be approved to use the RAC system. But after that, they pay for their compliance units and they make sure they make those ongoing O&M payments. But that's it. After they make those purchases, their compliance is considered complete. And so they'll have those two components: the initial capital purpose and the ongoing O&M. But that's it. The people that might be buyers in the system are MRP permittee holders, potentially developers, and then also other permittee holders for NPDES permits like Caltrans or Phase 2 permittees. Go ahead, next slide. All right, then the third aspect is those green boxes. This would be the administrators. Both jurisdictions and Contra Costa Clean Water Program will be administrators, but first we're going to go over the jurisdiction's role. So even when a jurisdiction is not a buyer or a seller, they will have a facilitation role in the RAC system. The first thing, though, is that before anybody can use the RAC system, a jurisdiction will need to seek approval through their governing body through a resolution, and then update their stormwater ordinance to formally recognize the RAC system to be used in their city. Once that's done, if a jurisdiction has an off-site GSI project in their jurisdictional boundary, they're responsible for the following things: reviewing and approving those plans, and this will be done through the typical C3 process. Conduct construction inspections to ensure that the facility is built to spec, as this is what's currently done through any C3 project. Then at the end of construction, the jurisdiction will be responsible to certify the compliance units and enter those units into the online tracking tool. Then the jurisdiction will be required to complete ongoing verification inspections so that the facility can receive its O&M payments. This closely follows what's currently done for C3 O&M inspections and what's currently required by the permit. And it's important to note that jurisdictions will be reimbursed for each of these actions that they perform. Now go ahead, next slide. All right, when a jurisdiction has a buyer in their purview, they will be responsible to approve the buyer to use the RAC system, and then help them find compliance units for purchase, and facilitate any of the agreements and the O&M fee. Again, the jurisdictions are going to be reimbursed to do all of these aspects. Go for the next slide. All right, the second administrator role is for the Contra Costa Clean Water Program. The Clean Water Program will act as the overall program administrator for the system. They will perform duties such as oversight of transactions, managing the tracking tool, annual reporting to the water board, and review the system for any adaptive management that might be needed. Again, like the other jurisdictions, the Contra Costa Clean Water Program will be reimbursed and paid for these duties that they do. Go ahead, next slide. All right, the final role in the system is the mechanism for the ongoing O&M payments. When a buyer makes a payment for the ongoing O&M, it's currently envisioned to go through a CFD. We'll discuss this in more detail later, but the CFD or other similar mechanism will manage the O&M funds. They'll be responsible for the collection of the O&M fees and the disbursement of the O&M payments to the offsite projects. It should be noted that jurisdictions will have, if we move forward with the CFD, they'll have a different mechanism for the O&M payments because we can't pay, or jurisdictions can't pay into a CFD. So it'll likely be an MOU or other agreement that runs very closely to a CFD, but wouldn't actually be the CFD itself. The CFD or other mechanism is currently being worked out, and we'll discuss this further a little bit later. All right, so I just explained the overall roles and responsibilities for each of the system participants. So I'm going to show you the diagram again, and kind of, if you follow through, this is how the system would work. So a seller would design and build a project. After that project is certified, the compliance units would be released to the system through the tracking tool. At that time, jurisdictions would start doing O&M verification, and at the same time, these units would be available for purchase from a buyer. The buyer could see these units through the online tracking tool and reserve them as they're working through their development process. Once a jurisdiction approves a buyer to purchase and use the REC system, they would pay for those compliance units, and the money would go back to the seller. At the same time, the buyer would agree to have their property be a part of the CFD or other similar mechanism for those ongoing O&M payments. A seller would show proof of the O&M that's been certified by the jurisdiction, submit that certification for payment from the CFD to receive those O&M payments over time. So that's the system in a nutshell. You've got a builder, a buyer, and then people that are just making it all work. So hopefully this is making a certain amount of sense so far, although I'm sure some people already have some questions. Going to the next slide. Before we get into the Q&A for the first session, I'm going to actually go over quickly how the certification process works and a little bit more about that O&M that we were talking about. Next slide. All right, first let's talk about off-site project certification. An off-site project would submit designs and go through a typical C3 review, approval, and permit process, just like any project would right now. This would be the same review and approval for any C3 project, and it would be submitted to the permit authority for the jurisdiction in which the project is built. So if the offsite project is built in San Pablo would review and approve that project. It's important again to note that offsite projects cannot be regulated projects. In addition, they must be LID or GSI projects as currently defined by the MRP. So this means infiltration, capture and use, or bioretention. These projects must also meet the 80% capture requirement as currently defined in the MRP, known as C3 provision C3D. I mention this because I know there's a lot of discussions going on about alternative treatment systems and other sizing for implementation. Those are not currently approved of the system, so they can't currently be used in the REC system. However, as the permit language changes and evolves, so will the system. And so we'll be looking into that over time. Next slide. For the ongoing O&M, the offsite project will also undergo reoccurring inspection and verification to confirm that the facility is performing over time. The local jurisdiction in which the project is built will do these inspections and provide the certification to the offsite project to be submitted for those ongoing O&M payments. These inspections would follow the same process as our current C3 O&M verification practices that go on as described in the permit. And again, the local jurisdictions would receive payment for doing these inspections. Next slide. Now for buyer approval or certification. As discussed before, buyers will need to get approval from the jurisdiction in which their project is located, so to use the REC system. So if a project is located for the buyer in San Pablo decides whether or not they can use the REC system, regardless of where the offsite project is located. There may be many reasons why a jurisdiction would deny a site from using the RAC system. So this approval is really important, and it's really important for somebody to get early on. The approval would be done through the typical development approval process. So when a project proponent comes into a city and says, hey, I want to develop this, I want to build this site, and I don't want to comply with C3 on site, they would need to tell the jurisdiction, I would like to use an off-site compliance option or regional alternative compliance. There are also instances where a site might want to use the RAC system to comply for only a portion of the site. So for example, a project might come in and they can treat all of their on-site aspects, but as part of the project, they're required to do some right-of-way improvements, some sidewalk improvements or roadway improvements, but those are not able to be treated on-site for many different reasons. They could then use the RAC system to only comply with those portions that they cannot treat on site. So once a buyer is approved for the RAC system and they make their payments, both sign up for the ongoing O&M payments and the initial capital payments, their compliance requirement is considered fulfilled. I'll go next slide. All right. Ongoing O&M was one of the hardest aspects to develop as part of the system, but it is likely one of the most important. Cities can get a lot of funding for capital improvements, but there are very limited ways for ongoing O&M funding. So the O&M system is a big topic and it is still under development. So I'm going to tell you what I can right now, and you'll see how the vision of it will work in with the system. Next slide. So currently the Contra Costa Clean Water Program is investigating the development of a CFD, or Community Facilities District. This process for any CFD involves the following aspects: the development of local goals and policies, which basically outlines what the CFD is for, a rate and method apportionment, or RMA, and this is what determines the cost of the CFD. Once these two aspects are determined, then this information is presented to the governing bodies and they choose if they want to move forward with the CFD, and this is done through a resolution of intention. After the resolution of intention, then you can start a public hearing process, and that's how you move forward with a CFD. So if the Contra Costa Clean Water Program and the Contra Costa permittees decide to move forward with a CFD, this is how it's envisioned to work. As part of the development approval process, a project buyer that wants to use the RAC system would be required to elect or vote to be a part of the CFD. This would be a condition of using the RAC system. Once a property elects to be a part of the CFD, and this is sometimes called balloting in, the property would be included in the CFD, and a special tax would be levied on that property each year through the tax roll. And that's how that money would go to fund the O&M. Next slide. So as far as the cost of the CFD would develop a study that would need to be, and this would determine what the cost of the CFD, and this is done through that RMA that I discussed. The RMA would also determine how these costs are increased over time. For offsite facilities, they would have an O&M plan and an agreement, and this agreement would be recorded to the property, and the O&M plan would determine the type and frequency of maintenance that needs to occur. The site would then be inspected to ensure that proper O&M is occurring, and once the O&M is confirmed, then payment can be received from the CFD system. So they do their O&M, they're certified it's complete, they submit that certification to the CFD, and the CFD pays them. Go next slide. All right, so we're coming to the end of kind of the first section of the presentation. But before we move on to Q&A, I wanted to show this slide that has the next steps. We are currently in phase 1, and we'll be completing our first exchange this year. After that, we'll be working on initial slow, small rollout. This is intentionally going to be a very slow process to make sure that we work through any kinks in the system and identify any issues that need to be addressed. We think that over the next 5 years, or by 2029, 2030, we'll have a fully operational system that can be used at a larger scale. So that's where we're at right now. And we knew that there might be some people that wanted to kind of see the system overview, but maybe not stay for a full 2-hour presentation. And so we wanted to have a little quick break here and have some Q&A for any of the initial questions about the overall system overview. So I'm going to hand it back over to Suzanne right now.
All right, thank you. So I'll just go over the Q&A. So here you go. At the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box. If you click on that, you can type in your question, and then we'll be answering your questions as they come in. So we're first going to be taking Q&A through this Q&A box before we open it up for oral questions. So we'll just give you a moment to type in your questions, and then I'm going to close out of the presentation so you can see all of us as we work on responding to your questions.
While we're waiting for a few questions to come up, we did have a comment earlier. They wanted to know how many folks are on the webinar. And so we had 69 people on the webinar when I looked down last. And so that's just so you know, we've got just under 70 people here today.
Great. We do have a couple questions that have come in. I'll start reading them out. One is, for how many years is the O&M fee paid?
In perpetuity. If you think about it, if you're building an on-site facility, then you're going to have to pay for that O&M the entire time. And so same thing with those off-site facilities. So and even if that facility, maybe one facility shuts down for some reason, they'll have to build another one to cover those compliance units, and that site will have O&M payments. So the O&M payments are in perpetuity.
It sounds like just
go ahead.
Which is, could the buyer pay an upfront lump sum for O&M instead of a yearly fee?
No. When we were developing the system, we did discuss that, but there's kind of two reasons why. One is, if you do it that way, you'll never get full cost recovery for the O&M performed. But two is that's actually would be a really expensive capital cost then. So if you think about it, you know, these systems, if you're saying what 20, 30, 40, 50 years they're going to be around. So making an upfront payment for that would actually be really expensive and likely cost prohibitive for a property or a jurisdiction to make.
Can all development projects participate, or are there on-site and feasibility requirements to be eligible to participate?
So for the RAC system itself, any project could participate. It will be up to the jurisdiction in which that project is located to determine whether or not they would allow the system to use the site. An example might be, though, like if a project is located in an area where there's a lot of pollutants, and they have the ability to do it on site, the jurisdiction might require them to just treat on site if they have the ability to do so. So it'll be up to the jurisdictions to develop their own processes and procedures on when they will and won't allow the RAC system to be used.
Who will manage the CFD?
That's an excellent question. I'm going to talk about what I envision rather than what's for sure, just because we don't know yet. We're currently going through the process of the CFD, but it is imagined that it'd be done through the county. The county does our tax rolls currently, and so the CFD would be countywide. It would be run through the county, and they would collect the tax rolls just as they do for anything else in Contra Costa County. But again, that's what we envision right now as we work through the nuts and bolts of the process. Those will be all determined.
Please share if there are any sizing rules or constraints to what is eventually built and how much any individual request for credit can be for.
Right now, we don't have any necessarily sizing rules. Any project size could be an offsite project, and any project size could if a buyer could only not treat 1,000 square feet, then they could purchase 1,000 square feet. There's no minimum. As far as maximum, it's really going to depend on how much area and actually can be treated. again, we are currently building the system so that they have to treat the 80% capture. So there, some people see really large systems down in the LA area that are more about volume treated, where here we do have the C3D requirement of that 80% capture. So even if we were to divert, flood control channels or whatnot, that would have to be a very large system to be treating the full MRP C3D requirement. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, you can add another one in there.
What are the jurisdictional boundaries for buyers and sellers?
Currently, the system can be used by anybody in Contra Costa County. If other counties want to develop the same or similar system, they can. But right now, we are just, if you're in Contra Costa County, then you'd be able to use the system.
Are there enough sellers to meet buyers' demands?
That's a really excellent question. We will be talking about this a little bit further, but I'll kind of give a little teaser answer right now of, we do expect that jurisdictions will have to be the initial buyer, builders or sellers. But we are hoping that over time we can get other entities involved in this, particularly potentially through kind of a pay for a P3 public-private partnership type system.
What do you see as an incentive for a private development project to be a seller? And isn't the cost of land too high to use and invest for this purpose?
I think that actually depends on where you'd be locating. The Contra Costa County is looking to develop regional projects, and we've found some potential sites across the county. And a lot of these sites are actually in areas where it's highly industrialized. There's a lot of legacy pollutants, and so land values aren't actually as high as maybe the downtown areas of some of our more affluent communities. And so as far as the incentive for private development, I can see a situation in the future where a large developer knows that they have quite a few sites that they don't want to comply on site or unable to comply on site for, and so they can build their own offsite facility, and any extra compliance units, they could be selling those as well. So there's potentially situations like that, but that would have to be someone that's pretty confident about what development's going to be moving forward and their portfolio.
What happens if the seller wants to shut down their BMP facility or use it for compliance for their own development project later?
So as far as use for later, once those units are sold, they can't be used again. You can't double up on those units, and that'll be tracked. And so we will know how many units are available and how many units are no longer available. And Tony's going to show the very cool tracking tool that we have developed to do that. But as far as shut down a BMP facility, that's something that we've discussed about, whether there's catastrophic failures or situations in which a facility gets shut down. That facility, as part of the system, they are agreeing to take on those compliance requirements. And so it is their responsibility to either then build a different offsite system that has the same compliance requirements, or they can't shut it down. They'll have to maintain it. And so that's something that is, it's in the risk profile of what we're developing, but we think that we can manage that, and that it, will make these systems available. And that's why we'd be really, really forward thinking on where we might locate these and how both public and private entities are involved in them, so that we have a good risk analysis going forward when these are built.
Typically, is it just the applicant who is electing to become part of a CFD? Does the participating municipality who is selling the shares play a role in this ballot process, this election process?
No, not, well, no. So when an applicant comes in, again, like I said, they would be required as to use the system to ballot into the CFD. I'm assuming that's how our elected officials move forward. So as far as the seller, I don't really think a seller would care who is paying them, as long as they get paid for their O&M funding. So a buyer is just required to be a part of this CFD or a similar mechanism and pay into that over time. As far as the seller, they would just, as long as they're getting their payments, I don't know if they care too much on where that money's coming from.
It seems like the buyer and permittee where the buyer is located need to fully document the C3 compliance through the RAC. So recording an O&M agreement for the buyer site would help document that, and it would just say that compliance was done through the RAC. Is that envisioned?
So let me break this question down a little bit. So the buyer and the permittee, yeah, we would fully document the C3 compliance, and that currently occurs. So we would have to, during construction, we would be confirming that the site was built properly and built to spec. And then, so at the end, we would certify that all of those units are confirmed. And then over time, we'd be doing those inspections to make sure that maintenance was happening and the facility was operating as intended. And so when the offsite project is being approved, you are correct. They would have an O&M plan, and that plan would be specific to that type of facility and the maintenance that would need to occur for that facility. In addition, the O&M agreement and plan would be recorded to the property, and that would be taken to the county. And so that's one way that we would ensure compliance. And I think that answers your question. But all of these things would also be tracked through that online tracking tool. So the Contra Costa Clean Water Program or a jurisdiction can pull up the tool and see that, yes, here are the various certifications. Here's the inspection reports showing that the project, was working, and that they were doing their O&M. And then they could also see that the payments were being received from the CFD.
You mentioned that it's going to be a regulated project, but what if they treat more runoff than what is required?
Yes, although I'm going to clarify that. If you size your facility larger, that doesn't mean that you get compliance units. However, if you're treating additional acres, then you could get compliance units. So yes, a seller in that case. So, we in general use the 4% rule. If you size your facilities to 6%, but you're only still treating the 6 acres you were required to treat, that doesn't work. But if you're required to treat 6 acres and you choose to treat 7, now you have 1 acre that you could be using in the RAC system, if that makes sense.
Are there any administrative fees collected outside of the permitting and certification process?
So we'll talk about the administrative fees in detail in a little bit, but to shortly answer your question, so when an offsite project is going through its permit process, it would pay the typical permit fees for whatever the C3 review is. A buyer, though, when they're buying credits, an administrative fee to both pay for the jurisdiction and the Contra Costa Clean Water Program to run the system would be included in that RAC system payment. And you'll see it's broken down later, so you'll see how that works.
Does the regional treatment facility need to be in the same local watershed as the development project purchasing credits?
So this is something that we had a lot of discussions with the water board, and right now the definition of watershed is the Bay Area, because that is our oh my gosh, Kelly, what is the term that I'm blanking on right now?
Well, that's our watershed, is the San Francisco Bay watershed.
Yeah. So I will say that the Contra Costa County is actually split into 2 different watersheds. We have part of the county that goes to the Delta and part of the county that goes to the Bay. Right now, we can't actually trade across those jurisdictional boundaries or that particular boundary, but anything within the San Francisco Bay watershed into Contra Costa County, we can do trades for. And we had long discussions with water board about that, and that's how they are defining watershed at this time.
And I'll just add that there is the question of hydromod. So for those projects that are subject to the hydromodification requirements of the permit, there are smaller watersheds that they would need to be worried about. But right now, we're not including hydromodification exchanges through the system. It's just for water quality. And for that instance, it's the San Francisco Bay watershed.
Good point.
Can you share a bit about how you worked with the San Francisco Water Board along the way and what their legal review of the instrument entailed?
Yeah. So in short, they were involved from the onset of before we even applied for the grant. We kind of approached them with this topic saying, hey, is this something you'd be interested in? Can we apply for this grant and work out to see if this would work? And they, indicated, yes, they'd be interested in allowing something like this, but devil's in the details. Then we had a technical advisory committee that they were a part of along this whole process. And so they were attending those meetings and providing their input. And then we were also submitting documents, draft documents along the way in which they were reviewing and then providing comments and questions in which we were answering. Later on, you'll see that one of the things that we really had to discuss with them was about pollutant loading and equivalency and making sure that this project was going to be treating both the same volume and pollutants as any sort of offsite and onsite project. So there was a lot of discussions on that, and we had some pretty detailed conversations and individual meetings with Water Board to make sure that they were comfortable with this. So that's as far as from a technical standpoint. And then from a legal standpoint, we went through a very lengthy, God, it was almost a year long. It was like 9-month legal review process where we legally reviewed it internally at the cities. We had external legal reviewers, and then we had legal reviewers from our regulators looking at this and making comments. And so we addressed all of those comments, and everybody felt really comfortable with where the system sits from a legal standpoint as well as from a technical standpoint.
Can a private seller treat public right of way?
That will be up for a jurisdiction to decide. So they're I know in San Pablo we would be very nervous about having a private developer treat in the public right of way. There's insurance requirements and whatnot that we would be concerned about. But if there are jurisdictions that would allow that, then they can do so.
What would happen to a stormwater treatment system that was built as part of the RAC if that site eventually is redeveloped in the future?
So like I said, that property owner, that seller is taking on those compliance units. When somebody gives them the money for it, that is their responsibility. So if they, for some reason, decide that that site in the future they want to redevelop, that's fine, but they then need to build a different regional facility to meet all those compliance requirements that they had already taken the money for. So they are then ultimately responsible for those compliance units moving forward. And so they could theoretically do that, but they would then have to build 2 different sites. They would be building their on-site facility and treating their on-site stuff and building another regional facility for all the compliance units in which they receive funding for.
There's a question that seems like it's part of a question and maybe related to treating in the public right of way. It's about what happens if something changes in the DMA.
So I think that's more of if this is a large regional project in the drainage management area or DMA, when we originally do the calculations, maybe there's a bunch of industrial facilities and those change over time and they're no longer industrial. We'd be treating those as what they are at the time of sale. So if it's 5 acres of industrial and maybe in 10 years from now that industrial gets moved to commercial or housing, the compliance units when they're sold, that's what the land use is used at. So we'd be taking account of that over time and watching that through the ledgers and seeing if there were big differences and adaptively managing the system to take that into account. But we want to get some projects under our belt and then we'll see how that goes and see how the different drainage areas look over time.
I imagine an agency wanted to reserve credits for a facility they built to serve as alternative compliance for public projects. But they need to manage that outside this program to ensure they can reserve that capacity?
There's going to be 2 answers to that question. If a agency builds the site itself, they can save as many credits and not put them on the system as they want. If someone else builds that system, they will be allowed to reserve it for a certain amount of time to allow an approval process to go forward. So there's some security, you're not looking one day and then those, units are sold and you're having to find different ways to comply. but it's not like you'll be able to reserve a credit for years on end for a future project that you know is going to be happening in 4 or 5 years, if you don't already own that project. So there is some reservations that can happen if, you know, and you have complete control if you own the project. If you don't own the project, then if you purchase it, then you can reserve it for future compliance use. But if you don't make that payment, then that seller can choose to pay to sell those credits to somebody else. So if a jurisdiction is willing to pay ahead of time and maybe, you know, hold those credits for 4 or 5 years, then yes, we could see that happening.
Will there be a RAC for Delta watershed municipalities?
Yeah, it's actually the same system. It's just they have to stay in their boundaries and we have to stay in ours. So it's they have the exact same system. They can use it. They just have a fewer municipalities that they can kind of place the systems in.
What happens if a buyer participates in the RAC and then the buyer sells the site and it's redeveloped again 10 years later? Does the second new owner get to automatically participate in the RAC, or does it reset the permit compliance?
So the buyer participates in the RAC system and then sells the site. And it's redeveloped again. I'm not really sure if I'm understanding the question, because so if they develop a site and they put facilities on site, they can sell it, but that seller that now owns the site is required to maintain it for those compliance units. And so regardless of who the owner is, the site is still has those compliance units. And if they've already been sold, then they can't be sold again, if that's what you're asking.
I'm reading the question as this is the buyer. So a buyer is developing a site and they are purchasing compliance units through the system. And then 10 years later, another buyer purchases that site and redevelops the site. So we have not talked about that instance. That's something that we'll probably be looking at further in phase 2 of the system development. But presumably if that new buyer would be subject to developing on-site treatment, then they would also be required to purchase more compliance units. I think that's something, you know, depends on how much impervious area is new or replaced, and what that triggers from the MRP. But that's a good question and something we'll need to explore further in phase 2.
Agreed. And just so you know, now I understand the question. The state is actually looking at some sort of general guidance for these types of alternative compliance system, because there's a few of them popping up in the state. And this is one of those questions that they're looking to provide guidance on how they would like to see that particular question addressed. So we're also waiting a little bit to see what the state comes up with, so we make sure that we're following whatever their guidance is.
You have an estimated cost on the price per square foot of compliance units? Does it vary site to site?
I'm not going to answer that right now, but we are going to discuss that later. So Kelly, we've asked for a lot of costs, and we've done a little study to determine what our costs might be, or at least a range of them. And so we will be presenting on that in the second session. So I don't think, because there's a lot of caveats around that, so I don't think we want to get into it too much right now, but we do have that and we will be discussing it today.
And then we have one more question, which is just asking us to compile the questions and responses and share with the group aside from the presentation. We will be compiling all questions that have come in through this meeting, so those will also be available.
Yeah, we, as Suzanne showed earlier, we have a project website, and so this presentation, the recording, and the questions will all be uploaded to that website.
Right, that gets through. Oh, there's one last written question before we open up to oral questions. When will the system be available for the buyers?
So for like a larger buyer audience. So right now we're just allowing for the jurisdictions to purchase. Once we have the O&M mechanism fully determined, then that's when we'll open it up to a larger audience of buyers. So I expect that to be in about 12 to 18 months. There's potential for us to do it a different way if there was a buyer that really wanted to use this now. but that would be based on a jurisdictional, whether each jurisdiction would have to decide whether they're going to allow that beforehand.
Right, well, we'll now open it up to any oral questions. If anyone wants to ask a question live during the meeting, just raise your hand, or if you're on your phone, press *9. Not currently seeing any other questions, so we can take a short break. We'll start back up at 10 o'clock. So if you want to go take a break, stretch a little bit, get some water, feel free to join us back up. We'll be starting back up in just a little bit more than 5 minutes at 10 o'clock.
Hey, Suzanne, we're seeing the presenter view right now.
Are you seeing the presentation at the moment?
Yes, but I'm seeing the presenter view. I think you just have to switch. Okay.
I think we'll be starting back up in just a few seconds. I just want to make sure everyone has time to get back to their desk. So if you stepped away, got some coffee, please come back. We're going to be starting back up for part 2. All right, Kelly, take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Suzanne. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be providing some more details about the compliance unit calculation. We'll be getting into some more technical details. I will say that everything I'm presenting today will be calculated through the tracking tool that Tony will be presenting on later. But we wanted to provide some of the background on how compliance units are calculated. So next slide, please. All right, so for the RAC system, our compliance units are called equivalent acres green compliance units. These are generated from the off-site GSI facilities that are constructed as part of the system. And this is an area-based metric that's consistent with the MRP requirements. They're calculated based on the pollutant generating area. We're defining that as 100% of the impervious drainage area and 10% of the pervious area. And all of these compliance units will have rainfall zone and land use associated with them that would be assigned using geospatial data. MRP provision C3E, which is the alternative compliance provision, requires that equivalent volume and pollutant load be treated at an off-site project that's used for alternative compliance. And in addition, provision C3E requires that net environmental benefit be provided when using alternative compliance. So to incorporate these factors, there are 3 additional factors that are used to calculate the total equivalent acres greened that a regulated project would need to purchase through the RAC system. There is the rainfall ratio, which is based on the difference in rainfall between the regulated project and the off-site GSI project that is generating compliance units. The pollutant ratio, which is based on the difference in land use between the regulated project and the off-site GSI project. And this is used as a surrogate for pollutant loading. And then finally, we have a net environmental benefit ratio, which provides assurance that a net environmental benefit required by provision C3E is provided. And these factors would not be applicable to a C3J retrofit purchase. Next slide, please. So getting into the rainfall aspect, we have pulled PRISM data, average annual data from 1991 through to 2020. And this was used to identify average annual rainfall zones across the county. Maps and tables were developed to represent the rainfall zones and to calculate the rainfall ratios that may be needed for an exchange between a regulated project that's located in a different rainfall zone than the offsite GSI project that is generating the compliance units that you are purchasing for your compliance. Next slide, please. So as an example, if your regulated project is located in a higher rainfall zone than your offsite project, so that is that more volume would be generated on your site and therefore treated by an on-site facility. Then there's a lower rainfall zone for the offsite project, so there's less volume being treated there. Then a rainfall ratio would be required to account for that volume differential. So we have an example here of a regulated project that's located in rainfall zone 24 inches per year. They're purchasing compliance units from an offsite GSI project that's located in 21 inches per year. They would have to apply a 1.1 rainfall ratio to account for that volume difference to get to that volume equivalency that's required by the permit. I do want to mention that the minimum rainfall ratio for the system is 1, and this allows for some conservatism in the overall RAC system to confirm that we're treating or at least equivalent volume across the system through all these regulated project exchanges. Next slide, please. In addition to the rainfall ratio that may be required, a pollutant ratio may also be needed for a regulated project exchange. We conducted extensive analysis to develop ratios to represent the difference in urban pollutant loading between land use types, using available land use specific concentration data. There are different categories of regulated project land use that could correspond to a pollutant ratio. These categories are residential, commercial, or institutional. Based on our statistical analysis, those have very similar urban pollutant loading. Transportation, which is defined as highways, freeways, multi-lane highways, and principal arterials only. I will mention that smaller local roads would be assigned the land use of the adjacent parcels. So if the regulated project, and then lastly, industrial. So if the regulated project is a transportation or industrial land use type, and they're purchasing compliance units that are generated from an offsite GSI project that's treating residential, commercial, or institutional land use, so a lower pollutant loading land use, they would need to apply a pollutant ratio to account for the pollutant loading difference between the regulated project and the drainage area that's getting treated by the offsite GSI project. And then if the offsite GSI project is treating old industrial and source areas, there is a discount, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So next slide, please. So in addition to the rainfall ratio and the pollutant ratio, which gets at the equivalency requirement in the permit for regulated projects that are using alternative compliance, we have also included a net environmental benefit ratio for the system, which is applied to achieve the net environmental benefit requirement of the permit. The standard net environmental benefit ratio for regulated projects that are purchasing compliance units through the system is 1.1 to 1. So that means that we're requiring additional 10% equivalent acres green to provide that assurance of net environmental benefit through additional volume and pollutant loading treatment. But there are a couple instances where this is not applicable. So for example, if you have a regulated project that is purchasing compliance units that are generated from an offsite GSI project that is treating old industrial land use, there is a discounted net environmental benefit ratio of 1 to 1. And this is because extensive studies have demonstrated that old industrial areas are generating higher amounts of legacy pollutants. And so in treating these offsite areas, there is an inherent net environmental benefit that is provided through that additional pollutant load treatment. And then additionally, C3G retrofit purchases, so permittees that are purchasing units through the system for their C3J retrofit requirements would not be required to apply a net environmental impact ratio to their purchase. Next slide, please. So we're providing this detail again to provide some transparency. We have even more details in the system summary report and available on the project website. We have given a number of presentations on the various components that go into the calculations. So the advisory committee number 5 provides considerable additional detail about these calculations. But again, just a reminder that as the RAC system is implemented, all of these calculations would be performed through the tracking tool. So you won't have to get out your calculators as you're trying to figure out how many compliance units you want to purchase or sell. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is what many of you are probably very interested in. We will get into some compliance unit costs and potential costs of an actual compliance purchase. Next slide, please. So a buyer will purchase Equivalent Acres Green compliance units proportional to their compliance needs. As I just mentioned, the Equivalent Acres Green is calculated, that potentially gets multiplied by a rainfall ratio or pollutant ratio to account for any differences in volume and pollutant loading. And then that is multiplied by a net environmental benefit ratio for regulated project purchases. And that is multiplied by a unit cost for Equivalent Acres Green. We are expecting that this unit Equivalent Acres Green cost will be the same across the system. So it will not necessarily be specific to the projects, and that is to provide some equity across the system in what that cost is. We'll be phasing that in likely over phase 2. And in addition to the unit cost of the Equivalent Acres Green that gets multiplied by the total number of Equivalent Acres Green compliance units that is required for the purchase, there is an administrative payment that is added to the total compliance purchase. Next slide, please. So how much do we expect Equivalent Acres Green compliance units to cost? We, as Amanda mentioned earlier, we're currently conducting a preliminary cost study. Many of you provided data for that cost study. Thank you very much. That provided a lot of great information for us. And based on our findings, or based on our analysis of that database, we are seeing right now that regional projects that are non-infiltrating are estimated to cost around $100,000 per Equivalent Acres Green compliance unit. And I will mention at this point that Equivalent Acres Green, again, it's 100% of the impervious area and 10% of the pervious area. So for a 70% impervious area, impervious drainage area, you would be generating 0.73 Equivalent Acres Green. So that should be noted. And then Green Street and LID offsite projects are quite a bit more expensive based on the data that we have compiled for non-infiltrating projects. So these are looking like they're upward of $500,000 per Equivalent Acres Green compliance units potentially. So if our overall RAC system portfolio is comprised of a combination of these, we could expect Equivalent Acres Green compliance units to cost $100,000 plus. And then we'll be using a cost study to determine the administrative fees for the program, but they're expected to be $2,000 to $6,000 per project and may vary by jurisdiction. And just a reminder, these are very preliminary estimates and there'd be additional work done to confirm those. Next slide, please. So the Equivalent Acres Green, in addition to the upfront compliance purchase, there's also an ongoing O&M fee Amanda provided some information about the community facilities district that would potentially be used to manage the O&M fees. And if permittees approve a CFD, the rate and method apportionment, or RMA, would determine the ongoing O&M fee amount. This would be investigated as part of the next phase of the project. But those costs would be collected via property taxes, as Amanda mentioned, for private properties, and would be collected through an agreement for permittees. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'll get into some exchange examples. And as a reminder, the calculations that I will be going over in the next slides would not need to be performed by participants unless they really wanted to. All of this is going to be happening in the RAC system tracking tool, but we're providing an example of how the calculations actually happen just for transparency and understanding. Next slide, please. So this is just a refresher on how the overall system works. A seller constructs offsite GSI projects. They request that those be certified through the RAC system. They receive certification. They're entered into the tracking tool. Then those offsite GSI compliance units are available for purchase. Buyer comes along. They want to purchase some equivalent acres green compliance units for their compliance. They make their upfront compliance purchase. The seller receives payment for the compliance purchase, and then the buyer is paying their ongoing O&M fees. Next slide, please. All right, so we have an example offsite GSI project. This is called our Bay Area Avenue Green Street project. It has been constructed to meet C3D, or 80% capture requirements. It is an LAD GSI project. So it's a mix of flow through biofilter plus Silva cells that are capturing the 80% and average annual rainfall volume. The site is located in an old residential land use area in rainfall zone 24 inches per year. And there's a total impervious area of 2.19 acres being treated by the project, and a total of 2.29 equivalent acres green compliance units that is generated by this project. Next slide, please. So these are the two drainage management areas that are being treated by the Bay Area Avenue Green Street project. There's a mix of, there are different size catchments that are being treated by facilities size per provision C3D, which is 80% capture of the average annual runoff volume. And again, we're capturing or generating a total of 2.29 acres equivalent acres green compliance units. Next slide, please. All right, so these 2.29 equivalent acres green compliance units are available. They've been certified. They're available on the tracking tool, and we have 3 buyers that come along and they're interested in purchasing compliance units. Buyer number 1 is a regulated project developer, John Doe Construction. They would like to purchase compliance units for their entire project boundary. And when we look at the 100% impervious and 10% impervious area on their site, we get a total of 1.15 acres. Hydro modification requirements are not applicable. They're in a commercial land use area in rainfall zone 24. A second buyer is developer Jane Doe Corporation. They would like to purchase compliance units for their right-of-way improvements only. They are located on a principal arterial, so they are the transportation land use, and located in rainfall zone 21. And then we have a third buyer, which is City of Stormwater, who would like to purchase compliance units for their 0.76 retrofit C3J retrofit requirement. Next slide, please. So we'll go through these exchanges one by one, how it would look, how the calculations would work in the system tracking tool, and what the total purchase amount would be, an example purchase amount. So looking again at John Doe Construction, they would notify the city with the development authority that they would like to use the RAC system for their C3 compliance. The city approves that compliance process. And the developer would submit the rack system forms that define their regulated project detail. Meanwhile, city would look at the rack system tracking tool to identify available compliance units, and they find that compliant units generated by the Bay Area Avenue Green Street project are available for purchase. So looking at Bay Area Avenue Green Street, this is located in rainfall zone 24, old residential land use. And we have 2.29 equivalent acres greened compliance units available. John Doe project is also located in rainfall zone 24. So the rainfall ratio applied to the exchange is 1-to-1. John Doe project is located or is proposing commercial land use. Based on our pollutant ratio, residential and commercial land use are a 1-to-1 ratio. So we're applying a 1-to-1 pollutant ratio to this exchange. And since Bay Area Green Street is not treating old industrial land uses, and this is a regulated project, a net environmental benefit ratio, or the standard net environmental benefit ratio, is required. That's a 1.1-to-1 ratio. So applying the 1.1 ratio to John Doe projects calculation of their 100% impervious area and 10% pervious, which is 1.15. Multiplying that by the 1.1 net environmental benefit ratio, we get a total of 1.27 equivalent acres greened compliance units that they need to purchase. Bay Area Avenue Green Street has 2.29 available, so they can sell John Doe project those compliance units. Next slide, please. So looking at the 1.27 compliance equivalent acres green compliance units that John Doe Construction would like to purchase, we are assuming a preliminary cost per equivalent acres greened of $150,000. This would assume a rack system wide mix of regional projects and Green Street and LID projects. However, if we end up with a lot more regional projects, this cost could be lower. So this is just preliminary. We're getting a total project equivalent acres green compliance unit cost of $190,500, a preliminary administrative fee of $6,500, and John Doe Construction would have to pay a total capital cost of $197,000 for their equivalent acres green compliance units. So that will cover their C3 compliance for their development project. And they would also be paying ongoing O&M fee of $43,020 per year. That's also a preliminary estimate. Next slide, please. All right, so Jane Doe Corporation is our next buyer. They're just looking for compliance for their right-of-way improvements that are required. They can treat the rest of their project on site. And they happen to be located on a principal arterial and in rainfall zone 21. So in this case, both of these would be requiring a ratio. Our rainfall zone ratio, I apologize, that should read 1.1-to-1. They have to apply a rainfall ratio of 1.1. They would have to apply a pollutant ratio of 1.3. And they don't get an environmental benefit discount, so they have to apply an additional 1.1 ratio. So Jane Doe project would have to purchase 0.26 equivalent acres green compliance units for this purchase. Next slide, please. And that rounds out to a total capital cost of $45,500 per year, including the administrative fee, and their ongoing O&M fee is $885,000 per or $885 per year. Again, these are all preliminary costs, but based on some of the preliminary data that we're getting out of the cost study. Next slide, please. So lastly, we have City of Stormwater. They would like to meet their C3J impervious surface area retrofit requirements using the rack system. They'd like to purchase 0.76 acres of impervious area. None of the ratios apply to this purchase, so they are just purchasing the 0.76 equivalent acres green compliance units. and they would be entering into an MOU. Next slide, please. So using our preliminary costs, they would be paying $114,000 for their upfront compliance purchase, plus the $2,500 administrative cost. So a total capital cost of $116,500, and again, an ongoing O&M fee preliminary on this slide. I will note that as mentioned, equivalent acres greened are calculated based on 100% of the impervious plus 10% of the pervious, and this requirement is for impervious acres only. We're assuming that the costs for a retrofit sale would be the same as a regulated project sale, and be managing the portions of the equivalent acres greened compliance units on the tracking side, but that's something that we may need to adaptively manage through phase 2, because technically City of Stormwater can only purchase impervious acres as part of their purchase. So that's just another little complicating factor. So that summarizes the examples and the potential costs that we could be seeing for these purchases for regulated projects and retrofit exchanges. And I'm now going to turn it back to Amanda to talk about the tracking tool, which will be performing all of those complicated calculations that I just presented on. Thank you.
All right. As Kelly mentioned, all these calculations that she just showed you are for transparency and how the system works. But for anybody that actually uses the system, they don't need to perform those calculations because we created a tracking tool as part of this project. Next slide. So the RAC system tracking tool will be able to do everything listed on this slide. So, you know, determine compliance units, track exchanges, they'll have a ledger of exchanges, O&M certification, and more. Tony Hale from SFEI is actually going to show you this tool. However, I just want to stress before he starts that this is just a demonstration. We're going to have a training session on how the full tool works at a later date, but we just wanted to give you, to show you what it looks like and give you a little bit of a taste. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce Tony Hale, who is the Program Director for Environmental Informatics at SFEI, and he's going to show you the tool that his team built.
Hello, everyone. I don't know if my screen is being shared. Is it successfully being broadcast, everybody?
Yes, it should be now.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for the opportunity to give you a little taste of the system that, as Kelly and Amanda described, will be operationalizing many of the different calculations, as well as helping to track all of those critical components, such as the compliance units, the terms of exchange, the buyers and sellers, et cetera. So again, just wanted to, we're not going to be able to walk through all the details here. We don't have the time, but what we can do is to give you a little sense of what it will include. So among the things we need to do is to make sure that there is a presence for the regulated projects, here described as on-site C3 regulated projects, and the off-site projects, and provide vehicles to get the information in. So some of you might be thinking, gosh, I already have a system for tracking all those regulated projects. What do I do to get it over there? And fortunately, you have an option of just importing from a spreadsheet to get all of that critical information into the system, or you can also add it manually through an interactive, easy to use tool. Same thing for the offsite project. So all of that is ready to go. But once the information is in there, then we do have this nice way to kind of browse through the information in the system using a combination of different filters. You can filter by land use, property ownership, et cetera, rainfall zone. So anticipating that you're going to be looking for those offsite projects, for instance. And then you can also search by browsing a map. So here we have just some sample projects, examples, just as The city of Stormwater isn't real. These aren't real projects, so I don't want you to fixate too much on this geography. But you'll notice that for this map, as I am zooming in, I want you to keep an eye on the projects listed below because they change as I zoom. So the list available to you changes by the extent of the map. So this regulated project, if I'm interested in it, I can dive in and get all this detail with respect to the critical features that make all the difference in making the calculations work. So a lot of the information is expressed in square feet as well as acres, and just as Kelly described, those things are calculated automatically. So you enter in the square feet and it automatically generates the acres. Moreover, there's a lot of automation built into the determination of land uses. So we've taken a land use layer as well as the Prism rainfall layer so that you can draw your polygon on the map and it will automatically calculate this pie chart of the land uses based on your information. And then there's a number of other different sections related to any given project, including the links to or the purchases made and linking to the offsite projects. But what I want to do is to just quickly go back to this map. And if I go in and I'm zooming into this particular site, you'll notice that it's automatically filtering to this extent. I can click on it because what I realize is that I am a seller of an offsite project, let's imagine. And I've gone in and I've entered this information, but you know what? I see a mistake. I need to be inclusive of this particular corner of the property. Someone had drawn it incorrectly. So what eventually people will be able to do is to click to edit this project. I know I'm moving quickly. I'm mindful of that. But as I come in here, I can go ahead and change this geography, this polygon. And just by moving its vertices around, as you see me doing, I'm able to make this correction. I can also upload any KML or shapefile. And so if I want to, I can just look up a file if I want to be very precise with my information. Having done that, then it would recalculate what you are drawing, and it's able to show any difference in square feet based on that geography. And down here, we have the drainage management areas, which are critical to the calculation, where you're able to say the different land uses, a lot of the material that would otherwise appear in stormwater reports. But in this case, these are for offsite projects and wouldn't be included in that. So we need to be able to build equivalency by adding in the facilities and making sure that all of that is reflected in the data to help facilitate the exchanges. So once all of this information is in the system, then the credits can be calculated, the compliance units and the regulated projects buyers can buy the credits for the offsite projects. In addition, the system can handle any attachments, any O&M reports, any agreements that would be critical to facilitate this exchange. Then there's, of course, areas for notes and such. What I'm not showing you is the whole back end that would have a ledger and a record of any transaction performed within the system that would be available to the select number of administrative users who would be able to certify different transactions and make sure that what happens within the system is all approved and helps to ensure that these transactions are maintained over time. So it is, in a sense, a financial record of these exchanges, both with the linkages of the regulated projects to the offsite projects, but also in terms of the actual helping to keep records of the exchange of compliance units. So with that, I am going to draw this little tease to a close, but I believe we might have time for some questions.
All right, if we can bring back our presentation and then
Sure.
finish this up. All right, we're almost done. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our next steps, and then we'll have our second question and answer session. And at that point, you can ask Tony any questions about his tracking tool. All right, go ahead, next slide. You already saw this once, but I just wanted a reminder that we are closing out phase one. And so we are currently working on our first exchange, and then we're going to have a slow rollout over the next 5 years for then the system to be more widely operational by 2029 or 2020 or 2030. Next slide. So right now, currently the city of San Pablo is at the 100% design stage for our first project that we will have compliance units available for sale. Construction for this project is expected in 2024. And another Contra Costa County permittee has agreed to be our pilot buyer for these units, and they're going to be meeting their C3J requirements with that. So these two entities are going to work together, and we're going to complete an exchange and do all of the agreements that are and have that all in place. We're going to do a short lessons learned memo about any of the recommendations we have after actually going through the whole process, and then that'll be submitted to be included in phase 2. Go ahead, next slide. So I wanted to really briefly talk about what's next, specifically for the permittees in Contra Costa County that want to be involved. So next, if a Contra Costa County permittee would like to participate in the RAC system, they will need to get a resolution from their governing body, sign an agreement with the Contra Costa Clean Water Program, and update their stormwater ordinance to include the RAC system. We have templates for all of these things, so we will be going through that internally, and you have a template to work from to do these 3 actions. Then in the near future, we'll have a training session about the RAC system and the tracking tool so that everybody knows how to use it. And then as compliance units become available, we can start using these units as an option as we need it. Next slide. We are currently working, like I said, on the documents for the first exchange and that lessons learned memo. And we're finalizing the cost study that Kelly had mentioned earlier that's showing, probably about $150,000 per EAG. In addition to that, we are also currently working on operational documents to describe all of the SOPs or standard operating procedures that the Clean Water Program and the permittees will need to go through as part of the system. So that's currently under works right now. In addition, after those tasks are complete, we're going to be working on the development of a funding and financing roadmap to find a way to build these projects. We are very aware that permittees will likely be the first sellers to build projects and to have compliance units available for purchase. So we are in the process of developing a way to fund these projects. We are also looking into all of the aspects needed for the CFD, and we are identifying location for regional projects in Contra Costa County. Once we identify the potential regional project locations, the Contra Costa County permittees will pick the top project for design, and that we will design it and that'll be our first regional project in Contra Costa County. All of the elements that I just mentioned that are kind of sub bullets in that second bullet, they are funded through the Water Quality Improvement Fund grant that Contra Costa Clean Water Program was awarded through EPA this year. Go ahead, next slide. All right. I kind of wanted to tease this out a little bit as far as funding. This is our last slide before our second Q&A session. And I know there's a lot of people probably wondering about the initial start of this type of program, especially because there's likely going to be a bit of a gap between when sellers build a project and when compliance units are actually sold. So we are currently looking into the funding and finance mechanisms to start this project off. This can include traditional funding like grants or maybe even state revolving fund, where we're looking pretty heavily into that. However, in other areas of the country, they've also used P3s or public-private partnerships and community-based P3s to help fund these systems. P3s come in many, many, many different forms, but they are potentially a way to help build and maintain this infrastructure, but also reduce risks on and cost on the public agencies. So this is something that we will be looking into, and I just wanted to mention this so people get a sense of how we're looking at the future projects from a funding standpoint and potentially even an operational standpoint. All right, so I'm going to leave that here, and I'm going to turn it back over to Suzanne, where we can start our second Q&A session.
All right, well, here we go. The rules are the same as the last time. If you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll wait a couple minutes to see if any start to come in.
While we wait, I really do appreciate, it looks like, basically everybody stayed till the end, and I know this is a really long presentation and a lot of information, especially if you haven't seen one of our previous presentations. So I really appreciate for that. I know this is a lot, and so I've been going through this for 3 years, and my brain hurts sometimes when I think about these things. So I really appreciate that people sticking on, and we are happy to answer your questions. And if you think of a question later, you have our email addresses, so please feel free to email us.
All right, it looks like we have a question. For calculations, how does the tracking system determine land use for public right-of-way areas? Are land uses already assigned to public right-of-way areas, or is the process automated and determined as needed?
Kelly, do you want to take this one?
Was that Kelly or Tony? Sorry.
Kelly.
Yeah, so I think that probably we do have a GIS layer that identifies adjacent land uses. So that might be used as like the initial assignment for adjacent, local roadways that wouldn't be the principal arterial and assigned to transportation land use. But likely those would be, verified on an individual basis as well. And potentially as needed, the land use would be updated if we're aware that, our buffer is giving us an incorrect land use, for example.
And just to clarify that a little bit more, Tony, can you talk about the layer that we're using, the MTC layer that we're using?
Right. Currently, we're using the most recent ABAG MTC land use layer, recognizing that it will be updated as new land use data layers are made available. I want to confirm what Kelly was suggesting, that there is an automated aspect to it, where you saw me drawing the polygon to represent a given project that will automatically determine, based on that land use layer, what the percentage of each land use is in terms of square feet and overall percent. But also we don't assume that it is absolutely correct. There could be some slight discrepancies, particularly because it could be dated and it could be out of date. So you are given the information, but then as the user of the system, you confirm the land use layers by square feet on the basis of either the information that you're provided or other information that you might have to reflect reality. So just to confirm, we are assuming Kelly's process of confirmation.
Next question, will the RAC system set the EAG unit cost, or will that be market-based and established between individual buyers and sellers?
So to create stability in the system, as we start, we will be setting the system cost. And so that's why we're doing that study, to kind of determine what that is. And as we get a portfolio of regional projects, that'll even more further provide information for that. However, it is envisioned that over time, we would likely be moving away from that. So as we get more and more buyer sellers into the system, what my thought of how it happens, so we're setting an individual price right now, and then over time, maybe we set a floor and a ceiling so that all prices are in a certain bandwidth. And then as we get even more, it would be a straight market-based system. So we're kind of easing ourselves off of a specific price over time. That's kind of what's envisioned long-term.
What reporting requirements will be required by the Water Board after they approve or accept the RAC system? Will it align with the same timing as annual reporting?
So yes, we will be reporting this annually in our annual reports. And specific reporting requirements, it's going to be a lot of similar to what we do with our C3. It's kind of how many acres, what type of acres, things like that. And I do expect that that will change over time as we notice certain, maybe, we tried to develop the system so that we could foresee any major issues. But we might notice that, hey, everybody's building in one particular area and we want to really move around the county where this is at. We might have to build the system so that we're encouraging certain types of projects in certain areas. And so we'll be working with the water board over time through our annual reporting and kind of adjusting the system and doing adaptive management to address that. And that's actually kind of outlined. So we have a system summary report, and that's online right now at the project website. It's our final version of that. And it talks about the adaptive management and the reporting and how that would happen.
San Mateo County has an ongoing RAC that has been funding green streets and regional facilities for the past few years. Has there been any interface or coordination with it in the research and development of the Contra Costa County version?
Yeah, so we've been in a lot of discussions with San Mateo. Theirs is actually quite different. And so Kelly can probably speak to this a little bit more, but they have a JPA, and so they have a very different mechanism that they can use to fund things. And it's my understanding it's only permittees that are involved in the funding of the San Mateo system, where we are talking about allowing outside private entities to also be involved in our system. So that's one area where it's quite different. Although my understanding is San Mateo is building towards that potentially in the future. But yes, we were doing this in close consultation with not just San Mateo, but all of the other Bay Area counties, because they were very interested in how this was developed in case they're interested in doing something similar.
Yeah, I'll just add to that San Mateo does not currently have a RAC system as we've defined it here. They are working on a regional collaborative program, and I saw Reed Bogert on the call as well, so you could ask him additional questions. They, as Amanda mentioned, they have a different structure, and the CCAG has been helping to get funding for their regional projects that are getting implemented, but they're still working on how cost shares actually happen between permittees. And it's true that most likely that first stage of the San Mateo program would just be limited to permittee exchanges, but over time that could also expand to regulated projects or private developers.
And there's a follow-up on the San Mateo County question. Are we addressing lessons learned from the San Mateo RAC?
I would say so. Yeah, there's been coordination between Amanda and Reed. I've been engaged in both processes as well. And so we are applying lessons learned from both to the other.
Is the land use layer Tony is referring to the same land use layer in the current AGOL or ArcGIS Online system?
It is the ABAG 2005 with the recognition that the MTC will be issuing a new update reportedly within this next calendar year. But I don't know what's in the Contra Costa. I assume it's Contra Costa AGOL system.
Yeah, that's the same. There's been some corrections to the AGOL, so we'll confirm that those are captured. But as Tony mentioned, there is this updated land use layer that we're hoping to be able to implement as well soon.
Kelly, for example 1, would John Doe be able to do some LID treatment on site and purchase EAGs for the remainder of the treatment? If so, could he use site design measures such as self-treating and self-retaining areas and only purchase EAGs for any impervious area not treated? It was unclear why a C3D required treatment area needed to include 10% of pervious area on the site.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it does get into, how this would actually be implemented during an exchange. So certainly if a developer is, using self-treating and self-retaining areas to treat their pervious areas. They would not need to purchase compliance units for those areas. Similarly, if they're treating some of their impervious area, they would not be required to purchase compliance units for those areas. They would just be purchasing compliance units for the areas that are not treated on site.
How many FTEs, full-time employees, are dedicated to maintaining the RAC system?
So it's kind of an interesting question to point like FTEs, but the full administrative cost that'll be determined as we go through the full cost analysis and through the CFD O&M analysis, because that's really where the majority, I believe, of the FTEs would be to maintain this. So we've estimated number of hours per project, but not necessarily number of FTEs. Now, the other side of that, though, is the maintenance of the systems themselves. And so that will be determined as we build the project. So there's kind of the administrative aspect and then the actual projects that need to get maintained.
Are O&M static too? Are they committed to in perpetuity?
So O&M costs are in perpetuity. And as far as static, no, with the caveat that the CFD, and that whole aspect is still under development, but you can build CFD so that there is an increase in cost over time. You can also build it so that there's multiple tiers of costs. And so that will all be determined as we go through the CFD process and go through that RMA. So, but yes, more than likely we will build into the system an increase in cost over time, recognizing the fact that O&M costs will increase over time.
All right, I see a hand raised. Helen Zhu, I'm going to unmute your line so that you're able to talk.
Sorry, I think I just hit the button unconsciously, and I don't currently have a question.
Okay, thank you. Okay, no problem. We do have one more question here in the Q&A. It seems like buyers would want to know that there is a cap on how much the O&M costs can increase per year. Is that expected?
Yeah, so the way really any CFD works is that that RMA has to show how the cost would work over time. And so as part of getting involved in the system, that information would be provided to the buyer so they know, hey, it's expected to be a 5% increase each year. I'm throwing random numbers out there, but that will all be clearly laid out in the CFD document so that buyers will know what kind of increases they will be getting over time, and that can be built into their analysis on whether they want to use the REC system or not.
Right. So it looks like that is all the questions that we have at this time. If anyone has any questions that they would like to enter, either raise your hand if you want to ask it orally, or you can push *9 if you're on the phone. And one more question coming in through the Q&A. Did you consider RAC contracts that have a limited lifespan, like 5 years?
We did discuss that initially. There are some systems in other areas of the counties that kind of have credits at sunset. That didn't really work with the way our permit does, so we did not really involve that in the system.
All right, well, I think that's it for Q&A. Maybe we can just move into closing. Is there any final closing comments that we have as a team?
I just, one more time, thank you for everybody that worked on this, whether you are on an advisory committee or heavily involved in the project or one of our project partners. Thank you so much. Thank you to EPA who funded the grant portion of this project. And for anybody that wants to see the full system summary documents, those are on the project website. And like I said, this presentation, and the questions will be uploaded to that site shortly. So thanks everybody today. We'll end a few minutes early, and hopefully this all makes sense and people are excited for this potentially flexible option in the future.
Thank you so much for joining us. We will stop the recording.
Thank you.